You think you know about Roman gladiators. You've seen the movies, watched Russell Crowe fight for his freedom, cheered for the underdog warrior. But what if I told you that everything Hollywood showed you was sanitized fiction compared to the documented historical reality? What if the actual treatment of gladiators was so systematically brutal that it makes modern prison systems look like luxury resorts? Today we're diving into the archaeological evidence and primary sources that reveal how Rome turned human suffering into mass entertainment. And if you think you can handle learning about one of history's most organized systems of human exploitation, make sure to subscribe, because we're about to uncover historical truths that will completely... Let me start with something that will immediately shatter your Hollywood illusions. Gladiators weren't noble warriors fighting for glory. They were mostly slaves, prisoners of war, and condemned criminals forced into a system designed to extract maximum entertainment value from their deaths. The average gladiator lived 6 to 10 fights before dying in the arena. Not 50 fights, like in the movies, not glorious careers spanning decades. 6 fights. That's the documented historical average. The recruitment process was where the horror began. Roman armies didn't just defeat enemies, they specifically captured the strongest warriors alive for the arenas. Tacitus records that after defeating Germanic tribes, Roman commanders would select the most impressive captives not for slavery, but specifically for gladiatorial training. These weren't volunteers seeking fame. These were defeated warriors, watching their families killed, then being told they would fight for the Archaeological evidence from gladiator schools reveals training conditions that were essentially concentration camps. The Ludus Magnus in Rome, connected to the Colosseum by underground tunnels, housed over 2,000 gladiators in cells measuring 32 square feet. That's smaller than most modern prison cells. Skeletal remains found at these sites show signs of severe malnutrition, repeated injuries that healed poorly, and stress fractures consistent. The training regimen was designed not to create skilled fighters, but to create fighters who could die spectacularly. Gladiators were fed a diet of barley, beans, and ash deliberately to make them gain weight and slow them down. Why? Because fast, skilled fighters ended fights too quickly. Romans wanted prolonged combat, dramatic wounds, and theatrical deaths. The gladiator diet found in contemporary accounts was calculated to create fighters who were strong enough to put on a show, but medical analysis of gladiator remains reveals the systematic nature of their brutalization. Bone evidence shows that gladiators routinely fought with partially healed fractures, infected wounds, and permanent disabilities from previous fights. Roman doctors treated gladiators just enough to get them back into the arena, not to actually heal them. One physician's notes from Pergamon described treating a gladiator's severed hand by cauterizing the wound. The psychological conditioning was as brutal as the physical training. New gladiators were forced to watch executions and tortures daily to desensitize them to violence and death. They were made to kill wounded animals with their bare hands as training exercises. Roman sources describe gladiators being forced to kill fellow trainees who were too injured to continue, teaching them that mercy was not an option. This wasn't warrior training. This was systematic psychological destruction designed to create humans. The weapon assignments reveal the calculated cruelty of the Roman system. Gladiators didn't choose their fighting styles. They were assigned weapons and armor based on what would create the most dramatic spectacles. The retiarius fought nearly naked, with only a net and trident against heavily armored opponents. Not for fairness, but because watching a nearly defenseless man try to survive was more entertaining. The Mamillo's heavy helmet restricted vision specifically. Training accidents were so common, they were built into the economic calculations of gladiator schools. One Lannister's accounting records from Capua list replacement costs for gladiators killed during training at 15% annually. That's not combat deaths, that's training deaths. 1 in 7 gladiators died before ever reaching the arena, killed by the preparation process itself. Their bodies were thrown into mass graves outside the city wall. The arena combat you see in movies bears no resemblance to historical reality. Roman sources describe fights where gladiators were given defective weapons that would break during combat, forcing them to fight with broken swords or splintered shields. This wasn't accidental. It was designed to prolong the entertainment and increase the likelihood of dramatic injuries. Gladiators fought, knowing their equipment. The animal hunts were perhaps even more horrific than human combat. Gladiators weren't just fighting lions and tigers. They were forced to battle dozens of animals simultaneously, often while chained together or with one arm tied behind their backs. Cassius Dio records a spectacle where gladiators fought 200 bears in a single day, not one on one. All at once, in a mass slaughter. Public executions disguised as gladiatorial combat were standard entertainment. Condemned criminals were dressed as gladiators and forced to fight wild animals with no weapons, no armor, and no chance of survival. But the crowd expected them to die bravely, to put on a show even while being torn apart. Those who showed fear or begged for mercy were tortured before being killed. One account describes criminals being sewn into animal skins. The medical experimentation performed on gladiators reveals Roman sadism at its most calculating. Galen, the famous Roman physician, learned anatomy by deliberately inflicting wounds on gladiators and studying how they healed or infected. He tested surgical techniques on living gladiators, using their bodies as learning tools. Many gladiators died not from combat, but from medical experiments performed without their consent. Their pain. The slave trading practices surrounding gladiators created an entire economy built on human suffering. Successful gladiators weren't freed. They were sold to wealthier patrons who wanted private shows. The most skilled fighters became property passed between wealthy Romans like expensive artwork. Archaeological evidence from private villas shows arena facilities where gladiators fought to the death for dinner party entertainment. Your suffering was literally. Female gladiators faced additional horrors that male fighters didn't endure. The gladiatrices weren't just forced to fight, they were often sexually assaulted before and after combat as part of the entertainment. Roman graffiti from Pompeii includes explicit descriptions of what male spectators wanted to do to female gladiators. These women fought not just for their lives, but to avoid being. The retirement myth needs to be destroyed completely. Gladiators who survived long enough to earn their freedom weren't released to peaceful lives. They were typically forced to become trainers, condemned to spend their remaining years creating new victims for the system that destroyed them. Archaeological evidence shows that retired gladiators had shorter lifespans than active fighters, dying from infected old wounds, chronic pain, and what we would now recognize as the religious aspects of gladiatorial games reveal their true purpose as human sacrifice disguised as entertainment. Gladiators were killed at specific times during religious festivals, their blood used in rituals, their bodies left unburied for days as offerings to the gods. The Munera weren't just shows, they were mass religious killings where the entertainment value was secondary to the spiritual. Children were not spared from this system. Boys as young as 12 were trained as gladiators, forced to kill animals and each other as preparation for adult combat. Skeletal remains from gladiator schools include numerous children showing signs of combat training injuries. These weren't apprentices learning a trade. These were children being systematic. The economic scale of gladiatorial slaughter reveals the true scope of this atrocity. Rome hosted gladiatorial games for over 700 years. Conservative estimates suggest 400,000 gladiators died in the Colosseum alone, with thousands more dying in amphitheaters across the empire. That's not including the animals killed, the condemned criminals executed, or the gladiators who died in training. We're talking about millions of human beings killed. The archaeological evidence keeps revealing new horrors. Recent excavations at amphitheater sites across the Roman Empire have found mass graves containing gladiator remains that show signs of deliberate torture before death. Bones with drill holes indicating crucifixion, skulls showing evidence of slow strangulation, bodies that were dismembered while the gladiators were still alive. These weren't quick combat deaths, these were prolonged torture. The social acceptance of this brutality is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. Roman literature treats gladiatorial death as routine entertainment. Family letters discuss gladiator fights like we discuss sports scores. Children played games imitating gladiatorial combat. The systematic torture and murder of human beings was so normalized that Romans complained when games were. Modern comparisons help put this in perspective. We're horrified by dogfighting and cockfighting, considering them barbaric cruelty to animals. Romans forced human beings to fight to the death for entertainment and considered it sophisticated culture. We have safety regulations for professional boxing and football to prevent serious injury. Romans deliberately engineered gladiatorial combat to maximize injury and death. The gladiatorial games weren't ancient mixed martial arts. They were systematic. The psychological impact on Roman society created a culture addicted to violence and death. Citizens who regularly watched humans being tortured and killed for entertainment became desensitized to suffering. This helped enable the other atrocities of the Roman Empire, the mass crucifixions, the genocidal wars, the systematic slavery. When you normalize watching people die for fun, every other form of. What finally ended the gladiatorial games wasn't moral awakening, but economic decline and Christian influence. The games became too expensive to maintain, and Christian emperors gradually restricted them. But they lasted for over 700 years, nearly 3/4 of a millennium of systematic human sacrifice for entertainment. That's longer than the entire history of the United States, longer than most religions have existed. The legacy of gladiatorial brutality shaped Western civilization in ways we still don't fully understand. The Roman legal system that influenced modern law was created by people who considered human death as entertainment, normal, and acceptable. Roman architectural techniques still used today were developed partly to build better killing facilities. The Latin language that influenced most European languages contains technical terms. Understanding the true horror of gladiatorial combat changes how we see both ancient Rome and modern civilization. Rome wasn't a sophisticated civilization that happened to have some violent entertainment. Rome was a civilization built on systematic violence and human exploitation that happened to produce some impressive architecture and literature. The Colosseum wasn't a triumph of engineering. It was a factory for producing. This history matters because the same psychological mechanisms that allowed Romans to cheer for human slaughter still exist in human nature today. We see echoes in how modern societies normalize violence, exploit the vulnerable, and turn suffering into entertainment. The capacity for systematic cruelty didn't disappear with the Roman Empire. The gladiators had no voice, left no memoirs, built no monuments to their suffering. They existed solely to die for other people's amusement. Their pain was erased as completely as their names. But the archaeological evidence remains, the skeletal testimony that can't be silenced. Every bone tells a story of deliberate human cruelty on a scale that should humble anyone who thinks. When you see movies about noble gladiators fighting for honor, remember that the real gladiators fought because they were forced to, died because Romans enjoyed watching them die, and were forgotten because their suffering was considered entertainment rather than tragedy. They weren't heroes, they were victims of one of history's most successful systems for turning. The most horrifying truth about what Rome did to gladiators isn't any single act of cruelty. It's that they systemized human suffering into entertainment for 700 years and called it civilization. They turned murder into sport, torture into art, and human sacrifice into culture. And they did it so successfully that people still romanticize it today.